My name is Eleni Chukovic. I'm the president of Kesher Israel. I'd like to welcome everybody here today for tonight's 6th annual Tzvi Daremblum Memorial Lecture featuring Leon Wieseltier on the topic of Messianism and the Jews. Before we get started, I'd like to take a minute and thank Ambassador Daremblum, his wife Gina, and the entire Daremblum Wasserman family for giving us this opportunity to host this event every year, and for also sponsoring the Tzvi Daremblum Memorial Rabbinic Intern Program here at Kesher. These two programs were established in memory of their son Tzvi, who lived, studied, and worked for several years in Israel. I'd like to welcome Ken Weinstein to introduce our speaker, but before I do that, I just want to acknowledge Ken for all the work that he has done. He's really the power behind and the force behind the Tzvi Daremblum Memorial Program here at Kesher. So I'd like to thank you for that. And without further ado, Ken Weinstein.
Many thanks, Eleni, for those kind words and for your dynamic leadership of our shul, which all of us deeply appreciate. I join you in your deep appreciation to my dear friends Jaime and Gina Daremblum for sponsoring this wonderful annual lecture in loving memory of their son Tzvi, as well as for sponsoring the rabbinic internship. Now, over the past 5 years, the Tzvi Daremblum Memorial Lecture has brought authors and academics of great eminence to Kesher Israel. Then Professor Michael Loren, Adam Kirsch, Jonathan Safran-Foer, Deborah Lipstadt, and David Brooks. Now, all of these eminences have had one thing in common. They're all friends of Leon Wieseltier. And we've become used to hearing Leon in dialogue with these noted figures, serving as impresario for these various discussions. Truth be told, this evening we did try to arrange a dialogue between Leon and the Messiah.
Did you have an email?
I did. But it went into that general box that doesn't seem to get a response. Now, it would truly be fascinating to hear such a dialogue. Of course, it would also simply be fascinating to hear Leon in dialogue with himself. But tonight instead, we will hear his thoughts on a passion for waiting, Messianism, and the Jews. Now, Leon Wieseltier, as we all know, is one of America's most prominent public intellectuals, serving for 3 decades and with great distinction as literary editor of the New Republic, where he has single-handedly elevated American public debate. Now, that may be a low standard, as Leon himself would be the first to admit, but he has done so in all truth because he's an astute and observant editor and reader whose acute insight is really only matched by his unique breadth, a range that includes fields from literature to philosophy, history, art history, theology, and Jewish thought. And through his Washington Diarist columns, Leon has both challenged the self-satisfaction that is endemic to our fair city, criticizing presidents and politicians, thinkers and writers on the left and on the right, and has become a leading voice for a responsible American presence on the world stage, one that is engaged yet moral and focused on the possible, especially on the defense of human rights. Leon paid special tribute to our synagogue, Kesher Israel, in his wonderful and widely acclaimed book, Kaddish, published in 1998, which he wrote in the aftermath of the death of his father, and he's continued to pay tribute to this shul by his active involvement, especially on the board. Now, we at Kesher pride ourselves on being a modern Orthodox synagogue, one, as Rabbi Freundel says, lives in the dialectic between modernity and orthodoxy. And no secular American public intellectual draws more heavily on the best of the Jewish tradition in his columns and essays on Jewish and non-Jewish subjects than does Leon. And we at Kesher have the good fortune of hearing Leon from the people's pulpit on various Jewish holidays and on Shabbat, offering Divrei Torah that draw, yes, from what he learned at the yeshiva of Flatbush, but also at Columbia, at Oxford, at Harvard, and beyond, drawing on the best of the Western tradition in thought and literature to elucidate fundamental questions in Judaism. But tonight, all of us have a very special treat, because we actually get to take notes, Leon. Write down what you say. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Leon Wieseltier.
Mine. Oh, it is. All right. Wait. I'm going to put this here tonight. I'm afraid I'm going to be a Bushender man. Thank you, Ken. Is that good, Howard? Thank you, Ken. It is a great honor to give the Tzvi Daremblum lecture. I have known Jaime and Gina and Naomi for many years, and for as long as I have known them, I have admired them. The commitment of the Daremblum Wasserman family to intellectual life, to democratic life, and to Jewish life has been plain for all to see. Out of personal tragedy, they brought forth a blessing upon our community in the form of lectures and internships and fellowships, for which they all have our gratitude. Tavo alehem bracha. For some time now, I have been working and not working on a study of Jewish Messianism. My thoughts on this subject originated decades ago in a long correspondence with Gershon Cohen Hamanoach, who encouraged me one day to develop them more fully. So for 10 years, every volume in the next book series has announced a book about Messianism for me, but the book tarries. A British friend of mine insists that I never had any intention of producing such a book, and that by promising and not delivering a book about Messianism, I was merely making a philosophical joke. This evening, however, I will present you with some of my thinking and my research on this book, and you can decide whether you would prefer the book or the joke. It is one of the commonplaces about Judaism, historical and spiritual, that it was responsible for the idea of the Messiah, that Messianism was Judaism's innovation or Judaism's gift, a gift that backfired on the giver when it was acted upon by those Jews who, precisely because they acted upon it, became known as Christians. But Jewish Messianism, as many historians and theologians have observed, was in significant ways divided against itself. In a people so given over to Messianic theory, the scarcity of Messianic practice is striking. From the very beginning, there appeared to be a contradiction between the intensity of the Jewish tradition's interest in the idea of the Messiah and the coolness of the Jewish tradition toward the prospect of the Messiah. This contradiction might be formulated more sharply. For the Jews, the history of Messianism has been the history of false Messianism. It is a fact of singular importance that the people who invented the Messiah has never accepted a Messiah. So the Jewish gift, if a gift it was not merely the idea of the Messiah, it was the idea of the Messiah and the simultaneous refusal to accept one, the reluctance to be redeemed. This eschatological skepticism was not merely a matter of circumstance, as I will show. Indeed, Jewish circumstance might seem to have mandated the opposite desire, the hunger for a swift historical release. But the culture of a minority, any minority, or of an oppressed people, any oppressed people, cannot be adequately explained solely by reference to its minoritarian status or its experience of oppression. Even in adversity, people inwardly determine themselves. So I do not believe that the messianic ideas of the Jews can be reduced to the circumstances of the Jews. Instead, I wish to show that the hesitation about the Messiah was internal to the messianic idea itself. In the Jewish tradition, the longing for redemption is regularly accompanied by a suspicion of such a longing. More often than not, the longing for salvation is something to be mastered rather than fulfilled. Now, for a believer, all this is not really a problem. A believer would explain that the distinction between the idea of the Messiah and the reality of the Messiah is not really a contradiction at all. The redeemers whom the Jews have rejected were turned away because they were not the true redeemers, since they did not meet the strict and clear requirements that the rabbis devised for the evaluation of any such eschatological claim. The intellectual consistency of this rabbinical stubbornness was very powerful. Consider this passage from an epistle by Jacob Sasportas, the 17th century jurist and polemicist who was the great opponent of Shabtai Tzvi and is one of the most unfairly maligned figures in Jewish history. In 1666, Sasportas wrote from Hamburg to the rabbis of Amsterdam. Ha'im ra'item b'shum sefer shemechayev la'amin l'mashiach l'mi she'omer al atzmo meshicha ana. Kodem asoto ma'aseh Mashiach k'divrei harambam b'ilchot melachim. Mashiach b'ma'asav hadavar talui. She'im lo kein Kol harotzel yitol shem Mashiach yavo v'yitol im chasiduto muchachat alav u'kefi hachasidim yirbu hamashichim. Have you seen it written in any book that we are obliged to believe that anybody who says, I am the Messiah, really is the Messiah, prior to his having behaved in the manner that Maimonides in his code of law specified that the Messiah will behave? Everything depends on the propriety of his actions. Otherwise, anybody who wants the name of the Messiah can have it if his piety has been proven, and there will be as many Messiahs as there are pious people. It was because he believed in the Messiah that Sasportas did not believe in Shabtai Tzvi. This is a perfectly representative expression of the traditional standpoint. Opposition to a Messiah is not opposition to the Messiah. When a Savior presents himself who meets the requirements of Saviorhood, well then the Jews will straightforwardly be saved. But an unbeliever and a historian cannot be satisfied by such an explanation for the Jewish lack of enthusiasm for redemption. He may seek a different kind of explanation, a political explanation, for example, according to which the power of a messianic figure posed too great a threat to the power of the rabbinical establishment. In such a view, the contradiction between Jewish theory and Jewish practice in the case of Messianism was the inevitable result of the refusal of rabbinical elites to entertain a challenge to their authority. No religious establishment welcomes a charismatic figure or a renewal of revelation. It is certainly true that messianic activism in the medieval and early modern Jewish world was often an expression of social and theological defiance. And it is true that there existed a strong rabbinic interest in the discreditation of messiahs. Yet a purely social or political explanation trivializes the perplexity that provoked the eschatological position of the rabbis. The contradiction between messianic theory and messianic practice was indeed an attempt to avert a collision between two types of authority in Judaism, but the aversion of that collision was more, I think, than the interest of an elite. It was the interest of an entire spiritual temperament, and the short name for that temperament is halakha, or law. The reluctance to be redeemed is a very startling thing. The Jews, after all, were in exile, and in many times and in many places, exile meant persecution. The wretched conditions in which many Jewish communities found themselves should have prepared them to welcome a great reversal of their fortune, and yet the opposite was the case. The reluctance to be redeemed was nothing less than an indifference to their own happiness, or a refusal to confer upon Jewish unhappiness a pride of place in Jewish life. And the same, surprisingly enough, may be said about the messianic expectancy. One of the most striking facts about Jewish messianism is that there is no correlation between eschatological activity and the experience of persecution. As Gershon Cohen long ago observed, quote, there is no discernible connection between persecution and messianic movements. Jewish messianic movements were not the religion of the oppressed. The Crusades, the Almohad invasion, the expulsions from England and France, the blood libels, the pastoral onslaughts, and the persecutions at the time of the Black Death, indeed even the expulsion from Spain and the Khmelnytsky massacres, did not generate a single messianic movement. Conversely, all the messianic efforts made in Iraq and Persia, and above all in Spain and North Africa, were undertaken in areas and periods of relative stability. Subsequent scholarship has somewhat complicated Cohen's picture of the distribution of messianic agitation across the various Jewish cultures. But even if there were some messianic stirrings in Ashkenaz, they were exceedingly rare, and much fewer than the miseries of Ashkenazic experience might have warranted. Cohen's main point still stands. Jewish messianism cannot be properly understood simply as a response to harsh circumstances. It was not chiefly a social or political or economic phenomenon. It was a religious phenomenon, the expression of a spiritual temperament within Judaism that clashed and continues to clash to this day with a different and more normative temperament within the same faith. The clash between Jewish Adventists and Jewish anti-Adventists may be described as follows. For the Adventists, or those who hunger to experience the climax, redemption is required for meaning. For the anti-Adventists, or those who hunger not to experience it, Redemption is not required for meaning, and meaning exists prior to redemption. Redemption, after all, promises an exchange of one reality for another, a transformation in totality. In the words of the great Messianic thinker, the Maharal from Prague, Biat HaMashiach shebo hitchadsut ha'havaya yigrom hefsed havaya rishona. The coming of the Messiah, which represents the creation of a new reality, will cause the reality that preceded it to be lost. It was the transformative nature of redemption that posed the problem. Historical transformation for the Jews has two phases. The arrival of the Messiah threatened the Jews not only with a consummation of meaning, but also with an expiration of it. The dream of a perfect future has always served as the standpoint for the most damning indictments of the imperfect present. For all its failings, however, the world in which the rabbis found themselves did not seem too paltry or too poor to nourish the soul or the conscience. The world as they found it was not everything, but the world as they found it was also not nothing. Their eschatological skepticism may be properly understood, in fact, as a defense of the sufficiency of their circumstances for the significance that they were enjoined by tradition to impute to their lives. And this sense of the sufficiency of the actual world is foundational to Jewish civilization in ways that have not yet been adequately explored. The rejection of redemption reveals an extraordinary confidence about one's spiritual situation. And the proof of this confidence in Judaism was halakha, or the law. The obligation to perform the commandments, ethical commandments, ritual commandments, implies that this imperfect world is not so imperfect that the ideal of perfection is impossible within it. The premise of halachic life is that the absolute is, here and now, adequately available. Jews, of all people, resolutely do not hate the world, and the halachic life may be seen as a regular rejection of such a hatred. If the Jews preferred to wait, it is because they did not lack the means with which to begin, because they were already in the middle. They could be patient for the end because they were already in the middle of an engagement, a steady and stable engagement with the eternal. Indeed, it was impatience that was deemed by the rabbis to be the supreme distortion that Messianism visited upon Judaism. Judaism, as is well known, Jews, as is well known, are forbidden to force the end and to calculate the end. They are forbidden, that is, to repudiate the present, which is the only and proper time for moral life and ritual life. For the rabbis, the fear of the Messiah was the fear of sin. They viewed the rupturing of history also as the rupturing of the ritual and ethical framework. And the law, as they knew it and observed it, was a theater of religious meaning more desirable than the abrogation of the law. The 4 cubits of halacha were capacious enough and enchanted enough. And so the 5th cubit of the Messiah could be resisted. The overwhelming Jewish preference historically was for waiting. Indeed, the Jews had a passion for waiting. A passion for waiting is especially striking in a people so regularly visited by suffering. I take this phrase, a passion from waiting, from Walter Benjamin, who once wrote, quote, that one cannot appreciate the charm of a cafe unless one has a passion for waiting. I want to suggest that one cannot appreciate the charm of the Mashiach unless one has a passion for waiting, at least if one is a Jew. There is something very radical and very beautiful about such constancy, about preferring tradition to salvation. This preference is stated with surprising candor throughout the medieval and modern tradition. Let us follow it briefly, beginning in 1263, in a remarkably blunt statement about Messianism made by Nachmanides on the 2nd day of the dramatic disputation in Barcelona. Nachmanides addressed his words directly to the king, James I of Aragon, who keenly attended the discussion. Adoni ha-melech shma'eni, ein hadin b'ha'emet b'hamishpat shelanu ikaro b'mashiach, ki ata shaveh li yoter mi-mashiach, ata melech v'hu melech, ata melech goy v'hu melech Yisrael, ki Mashiach eino ela basar badam kamocha. My Lord King, hear me. The essence of our law and our teaching is not the Messiah. You are worth as much to me as the Messiah. You are a king, he is a king. You are the sovereign of your nation, he is the sovereign of Israel. for the Messiah is nothing other than a king of flesh and blood, such as yourself. Nachmanides' point in this exchange was not only to diminish the centrality of Messianism in Judaism, he proceeded to a still more startling remark, again addressing the king. כשאני עובד את בוראי ברשותך בגלות ובעינוי ובשיבוד בחרפת העמים אשר יחרפוני תמיד שכרי מרובה כי אני עושה עולה לאלוהים מגופי ובזה אזכה לחיי עולם הבא יותר ויותר אבל כשיהיה מלך ישראל מתורתו מושל בכל הגויים ועל כורחי יש לי לעמוד בתורת היהודים אין שכרי מרובה כל כך. When I serve my Creator by your leave in your realm, he was addressing James first, in the conditions of exile and persecution and servitude in which we suffer the scorn of the nations daily, my reward is great, for I am making of my body an offering to my God, and therefore I am more and more worthy of life in the world to come. But when a king of Israel, a king of my own faith, will rule the world, and I will perforce abide by the laws of the Jews, my reward will not be so considerable. Nachmanides is basically arguing for the spiritual utility of adversity. It is almost an argument for exile. The passage is especially surprising in the light of Nachmanides' own emigration to the Holy Land in the aftermath of the Barcelona disputation. And it reverberates interestingly for present-day disputations about Judaism in a Zionist and post-Zionist world. But never mind the contemporary relevance now. It is Nachmanides' circumscription of the Messianic idea that I want to illustrate. In this avowal of the great rabbi, we find the Jewish attachment to the world, the insistence that the observance of the commandments is the Jews' highest purpose, and the confidence that adversity and exile do not impair the Jews' ability to fulfill that purpose. Some of Nachmanides' bluntness in this text may be attributed, of course, to the charged context in which he was speaking. Indeed, the discussion of Messianism throughout the medieval tradition was frequently accompanied by the harsh echoes of the disputations between the Jews and the Christians about the interpretation of biblical and rabbinical eschatology. Yet it is clear from his other writings that Nachmanides' relaxation of messianic urgency was not merely an external or polemical matter. His polemic, rather, was a sharp expression of his internally considered view of the place of the end in Jewish life. Sefer HaGeulah, or the Book of Redemption, which appears to have been composed also in the early 1260s, is addressed not to the Christian authorities of Spain, but to his own brethren, and it includes this reflection on Messianism. This I'll read only in English. Know, God help you, that were we to decide in our hearts that our sins and the sins of our fathers have disqualified us from the promises of consolation, and so the exile will lengthen and endure without end, and were we also to conclude that God wished to torment us for his own reasons or for our own good in this world by subjugating us to the nations, none of this would do any harm to the foundations of our faith. For the purpose of our reward is not the Messianic era, and to enjoy the fruit of the Holy Land or the hot springs of Tiberia or other such pleasures. Even the restoration of the sacrifices and the services at the temple is not our highest wish. No, the object of our desire and of our gaze is the world to come, and the delight of the soul in the delight known as the Garden of Eden. So the belief in the Messiah has a place in Jewish faith for Ramban, but it does not have pride of place. The objective of the faith is not redemption. The objective of the redemption is faith. One of the most striking elements of this remarkable statement is Nachmanides' unequivocal promotion of the individual over the collective and the spiritual over the historical. And the rabbi's patience about the Mashiach strikes one with even greater force a few pages later in his treatise, where he records his own conviction, she'anachnu ba'acharit hayamim, that we are ourselves living in the end of days. Perhaps he himself even enjoyed the hot springs of Tiberia. This historical patience had a long career in the history of the Jews. I will give some examples so as to gradually build this portrait of this unmessianic messianism. The same calming influence may be detected in a work called Or Adonai, or The Light of the Lord, which Chasdai Kreskas, the fiercely anti-Maimonidean thinker and one of the great statesmen of the Jewish community in Spain, completed in Saragossa in 1410. Or Adonai was the first part, the philosophical part, of Kreskas's projected systematic treatment of Jewish beliefs and practices. And in the third section of his book, he lists those articles of faith that, quote, we have seen fit to include among the cornerstones of the Torah, so that the belief in them is mandatory and the denial of them is a rebellion so enormous that the denier must be counted among the heretics. I mean those beliefs without which the existence of the Torah cannot be imagined. Among these necessary and inalienable beliefs, Kreskas elected not to include the belief in the Messiah. Indeed, he could not have been clearer about the loss of priority. HaMashiach be'edro kvar yitzuyar mitziyut HaTorah. In the absence of the Mashiach, the reality of the Torah can already be grasped. This moderation of the eschatological appetite was expressed by a man whose own son had been murdered by the anti-Jewish mob in Barcelona in 1391. Joseph Albo was a student of Chasdai Kreskas. In 1413, he played a prominent role in the disputation at Tortosa, the longest and the most troubling of all the debates that the medieval Christians imposed upon the medieval Jews. In the Latin protocol of that confrontation, I will not give you the Latin, it is recorded, quote, that as if in a great rage, Rabbi Joseph Albo spoke as follows: suppose it were proved to me that the Messiah had already arrived, I would not consider myself a worse Jew for it. So one's Judaism does not stand or fall on one's Messianism. Albo was making the same point at the debate in Tortosa that Nachmanides had made a century and a half earlier at the debate in Barcelona. But Albo's account of Messianism, like Nachmanides, was not dictated by political pressure. In 1425 in Castile, Albo completed his great work on Jewish belief, Sefer HaIkarim, or the Book of Principles. It was written in part to fortify Jewish belief in the wake of Tortosa, which had been the cause of a significant number of Jewish conversions to Christianity. Near the conclusion of his treatise, Albo discusses the place of Messianism in Judaism. Kol mi she'eino ma'amin b'biyat HaMashiach hu kofer b'divrei hanbi'im ve'over al mitzvat aseh. Aval mikol makom ein ha'amanat b'yat HaMashiach ikar shetibatel Torah bichlala im lo yaminehu adam. Whoever does not believe in the coming of the Messiah denies the words of the prophets and violates a positive commandment, and yet the belief in the coming of the Messiah is not so fundamental that the failure to believe it will annul the Torah in its entirety. So in Nachmanides, in Kreskas, in Albo, the survival of Judaism is more vital than the arrival of the Mashiach. And this medieval Jewish disposition has a long subsequent history. In Italy, in the latter half of the 16th century, at the conclusion of a comprehensive and skeptical review of the traditions of messianic calculation in Judaism, Azaria de Rossi cited Nachmanides' demotion of messianism as the last word on the subject. In his revolutionary work, Me'or Einayim, or The Light of the Eyes, the book that inaugurated the critical study of Jewish history, Azaria called the Nachmanidean position dearer than gold and sweeter than honey. And after quoting it at length, he epitomized it this way, quote, our goal is not the Messianic era, it is only the keeping of the Torah, along with the hoped-for reward, no matter in what time or in what way it comes to us from God. Whether our redemption comes soon or whether it comes late, when we least expect it, we will not deviate from any of our obligations. This principle of historical composure makes a forceful appearance elsewhere in the 16th century, in Greece. There, Azaria's contemporary Solomon ben Isaac Halevi, known as Shlomo Lebeit Halevi, a great preacher and communal leader and the grandson of exiles from Portugal, asserted in a sermon in a synagogue of Portuguese refugees in Salonika that, quote, Yadua lanu she'en tofsim b'torat Moshe ba'avur she'yavo HaMashiach, adarabah. Anu ma'aminim b'biyat HaMashiach ba'avur she'anu tofsim b'torat Moshe. Ki gam im ya'aleh al hadat shelo yavo HaMashiach, Moshe emet v'torato emet. It is commonly known that we do not uphold the Torah of Moses so that the Messiah will come. Quite the contrary. We believe that the Messiah will come because we uphold the Torah of Moses. Even if we conjecture that the Messiah will not come, Moses is truth and his Torah is truth. The point could not be clearer. In a sermon in the winter of 1573, Shlomo remarked, Harbe pa'amim ani omer lahamon she'ein adam Yehudi ba'avur she'atid lavo HaMashiach. Ki ben kach uben kach ha'adam Yisraeli chayav liot Yehudi mitzad amitenu ba'atzmo. Many times I preach to the populace that a man's reason for being a Jew is not that in the future the Messiah will arrive. Whether the Messiah arrives or does not arrive, an individual of Israel is obligated to be a Jew by the intrinsic truth of Judaism. It is just as well that Solomon lectured on the limits of Messianism often during the year, because on that particular Shabbat, his cautionary words about a historical convulsion were defeated by a natural convulsion. In a brief preface to this sermon, Solomon records an extraordinary event. Quote, "As I was preaching, the ground shook powerfully, and only I did not feel the earthquake, owing to the intensity of my devotion to the words of the Torah. Most of the people who were present in the synagogue got up and fled." And so the rabbi taught the great lesson of eschatological patience to an empty room. He insisted that the world would not turn upside down, even as it was turning upside down. In 1625, Rabbi Saul Mortera preached a sermon on Sukkot to his congregation in Amsterdam. The congregation was comprised of Jews who had once lived as Christians in Portugal, and in Amsterdam replaced their false Christian identity with a true and in some ways quite militant Jewish identity. Some years later, Mortera acquired a brilliant pupil called Baruch Spinoza, and in 1656 he played a role and thereby achieved a certain modern notoriety in Spinoza's excommunication. In his sermon on Sukkot in 1625, the text of which was not long ago discovered by our friend Mark Saperstein, Mortera pauses in the middle of a philological discussion of the name of the city of Jerusalem to make this ringing declaration: "Ein shlemutenu gdulatenu tluya b'gdulat Yerushalayim. Yavo Mashiach or lo yavo, Yehudim anachnu. Halo kol inyanenu hu shmirat haTorah." Our perfection and our greatness do not depend on the greatness of Jerusalem. If the Messiah comes and if the Messiah does not come, we are Jews, and all that concerns us is the observance of the Torah. Please note that Mortera, like the others, has not denied the belief in the Mashiach. He has instead demoted it. In the 19th century, Rabbi Moses Sofer, the Chassam Sofer, the great jurist in Pressburg and the most brilliant enemy of modernity that Judaism ever produced, reprised this tradition of eschatological moderation. In a responsum on the question of dogma in Judaism, Sofer declared that the belief in the Messiah is an important Jewish belief, but not an essential Jewish belief. אי אפשר לי להאמין בשום אופן שיהיה גאולתנו אחד מעיקרי הדת. ושאם ייפול היסוד תיפול החומה חלילה. ושנאמר אילו היה חס ושלום חטאינו גורמים שיגרש אותנו גירוש עולם, המפני זה גם רשאים אנו לפרוק עול מלכות שמיים, או לשנות קוצו של יוד. It is impossible for me to believe that our redemption is one of the foundations of our faith, so that if this stone is removed, the walls will come tumbling down, heaven forfend. Even were we to say, God forbid, that our sins have warranted that God condemn us to an eternal exile, is this a sufficient reason to throw off the yoke of him? Sofer wrote those words in the spring of 1836, when the air was thick with expectation about the year 1840, a year whose messianic potential had been proclaimed by no less a source than the Zohar itself. I will conclude this tour, and many more stops could have been made, in the 20th century, when the cause of Jewish inexcitability was taken up most memorably by a non-legal thinker and a secular Jew, who nonetheless thought obsessively and tormentedly about the law. I am referring to Kafka. In his notebooks for 1917-1918, Kafka wrote this aphorism, quote, "There are two human sins from which all the others derive, impatience and indolence. It was because of impatience that they were expelled from paradise. It is because of indolence that they do not return. Yet perhaps there is only one major sin, impatience. Because of impatience they were expelled. Because of impatience they will not return." And later, in one of his most famous paradoxes, Kafka wrote, "The Messiah will come only when he is no longer necessary. He will come only on the day after his arrival. He will come not on the last day, but on the very last." All these Jewish thinkers believed in the Messiah, and all of them were content for the Messiah to tarry. For all of them, redemption was in some way redundant. They traded paradise for bliss, or for the pursuit of bliss. And this trade, this feeling of the redundancy of redemption, is one of the defining achievements of the Jewish tradition and one of the conditions of its vitality. There is, of course, a great diversity of eschatological opinion within Judaism. I want to be absolutely clear about this. And not all of the opinions reflect the even and balanced temper about the end that I have been describing. There were also Jews who burned with salvific desire. There was an old strain of Jewish Messianism that was militantly utopian and militantly apocalyptic, that dreamed of discontinuity and thirsted for a new beginning. This new beginning would be announced by a number of signs, and foremost among them was the abrogation of the law. Antinomianism is an old and recurring feature of apocalypticism in Judaism. The impatience with history was frequently expressed as an impatience with law. In the age of redemption, certain laws will become obsolete. The Talmud explains, for example, that the Hebrew word for pig, chazir, is owed to the fact that Atit HaKadosh Baruch Hu lahachziro Yisrael. In the future, God will restore lahachziro to Israel. The entire system of law may even be replaced with a hilchata de Meshicha, or a messianic law, whatever that is. For the apocalypticists, there was an essential tension between law and redemption. They were prepared to overthrow their duty for their happiness. Gershom Scholem maintained famously that this tension was characteristic not only of Jewish apocalypticism, but of all of Jewish messianism. Rabbinic authority and messianic authority could not but clash. In this regard, Scholem claimed too much. For the striking fact about apocalypticism in Judaism is that it is not remotely coterminous with messianism. The normative Jewish belief in the Messiah was not an expectation of the disruption of the system of meaning in which the community already lived. It was Maimonides who established this historical sobriety most definitively. Unlike many of the authorities that I have just cited, Maimonides emphatically included the belief in the Messiah among the foundations of Judaism. It was, you recall, the 12th of the 13 principles that comprised in his controversial catechism the dogmas of Judaism. And yet his interpretation of Messianism is one long instruction, one long lesson in patience and equilibrium. In the famous last chapter of his great code of Jewish law, he treats first the Messiah and then the Messianic age. About the Messiah he writes, quote, "Do not assume that the Messiah must perform signs and miracles or introduce any new thing into the world or resurrect the dead or the like. For the laws and the statutes of our Torah are for always and for all time. There is no adding to them and no subtracting." The anti-antinomianism here could not be more plain. Eschatology finds its limits in the law. Not only is the abrogation of the law not a sign of the advent of the Messiah, the abrogation of the law is a sign that the Messiah who appeared was an illusion and a hoax. In the uncensored version of this chapter of the Mishnah Torah, which includes an explicit refutation of the messianic pretensions of Jesus, Maimonides makes the supremacy of halakha and its role as the proper context for considering the end of history completely clear. When the Mashiach arrives, he declares, those who maintain that he would nullify the law, who said that, quote, the commandments were true but they have lost their validity, will recant and realize that they have inherited nothing but lies from their fathers. And in his most famous passage, Al ya'aleh al halev shebiyat HaMashiach yivatel davar miminhago shel olam o yeshum chidush b'maaseh breshit ela olam keminhago nohei. Do not assume that in the days of the Mashiach any of the laws of nature will be annulled or that any new thing will be introduced into the order of creation. The world will follow its customary course. So for the Messianic age to be experienced as the fulfillment of what came before, some continuity with what came before is necessary. Rambam made the Mashiach less fearful by making the Mashiach less revolutionary, by assuring the community that upon the arrival of the Mashiach, their world would still be recognizable. The transformation would not be total. Maimonides most famously said that the sole difference between the present age and the Messianic days is delivery from servitude to foreign powers. The change would be mainly political. The world would be made not new, only better. This was a Messianism that preserved the identity of the world and the identity of the self. In Judaism, we might say, law is the antithesis of utopia. There is in a variety of medieval and early modern Jewish thinkers the view that the immutability of the Torah, which is of course an axiom of Jewish faith since antiquity, guarantees the immutability of the world that was created for it to be fulfilled in. I will not trouble you with these texts now, except to note their implication that a belief in the law entails a belief in the world. The world that abides is not a perfect world. The need for law is itself evidence of its imperfection, but it is a sufficient world, a world right for its purposes. The commitment to normativity removes the grounds for a rejection of the world, and also for the hunger to destroy it so as to renew it. Normativity is here the antidote to the nihilistic element, the appetite for destruction in the apocalyptic critique of the world. The acceptance of the world that is a condition of the law is not a form of complacence, since the law, especially the moral law, is itself a standpoint for criticizing the world and for not conforming to it. But the law-abiding Jew nonetheless feels here and now adequately conditioned for a significant life. There remains, of course, the matter of messianic calculation in Judaism. The Jewish tradition of messianic calculation was very long. It amounts, in fact, to an entire genre of Jewish literature. This vein of messianic speculation, which was often based upon the numerological interpretation of biblical phrases and verses, produced the following years as the dates for the coming of the Mashiach, if the people of Israel made themselves worthy for it. 110, 140, 240, 620, 968, 1130, 1218, 1230, 1306, 1334, 1358, 1403, 1430, 1440, 1503, 1530, 1575, 1598, 1640, 1648, 1713, 1725, 1840, 1850, 1868, 1931. Get it? All these miraculous years, despite the ancient warning against calculating the end. And that was only a partial listing of those auspicious and deceiving years. So to what end all these calculations, all this arithmetic? In the light of the composure that I am describing, how are we to interpret all these redemptive numbers? There were many medieval calculations that proposed not a precise date, but a loose time frame, a period in history, or in the medieval vocabulary, a cycle of creation, when the Mashiach is likely to arrive. For example, in 1497, in his book Yeshuot Mashiach, or The Redemptions of His Savior, the ardent Messianist Yitzchak Abravanel declared that all messianic calculation must be general. Its task, he wrote, is to analyze history into three periods: the period during which the Advent is impossible, the period during which the Advent is possible, and the period during which the Advent is necessary. That is not the sort of historical information that makes you pack your bags. There is a difference between messianic calculation and messianic activism. Indeed, many of the ancient and medieval calculations projected the redemption many years into the future, well beyond the lifetime of the respective writers and their contemporaries. For the speculators, the year 6000 was an especially enchanted time, the next Jewish millennium, which will arrive in the Christian year 2240. Let us all be glad that we will miss it. The messianic calculations then were not designed to incite, though some of them did. They were designed, rather, to console. They were promises, not plans. The problem that they were designed to solve was not the problem of Jewish exile. It was the problem of Jewish despair. For the messianic calculators were playing with fire. Eschatological precision ran the risk of eschatological disappointment. This was clear already in the Talmud. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Tipach atzmatan shel machashvei kitzin, shehiyu omrim kevan shehigia et haketz v'hu lo ba, shuv eino ba, ela chakeh lo. Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachmani said in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, may the bones of those who calculate the end be blasted. For they would conclude that since the determined time has come, but the Messiah has not arrived, he will never arrive. No, we must wait for him. Similarly, in the 11th century, Moses ibn Ezra, in his treatise on Hebrew poetry, sardonically dismissed messianic calculations as, quote, ignorance that will do no harm and wisdom that will do no good. A century later, Maimonides' 12th dogma included the indeterminacy of the messianic advent as part of the belief in the Mashiach. The 12th dogma is the belief in the messianic age, to wit that one must believe and attest that he will come and never think that he will come too late, and one must not fix a specific time. Nachmanides warned that the disclosure of the date of redemption would lead, quote, to a demoralization and a weakening of the hope of the people. This is especially striking because Nachmanides himself engaged in eschatological computation and promoted the year 1358 as his favorite messiah. He explained his apparent inconsistency this way, quote, what we have said about the end, these are divrei shema ve'efshar. Those are words of maybe and perhaps. We possess no knowledge on the basis of which a certain truth may be inferred, so that we could say, it is such. We are not prophets who can vouchsafe the secrets of God. It is rather the case that we hope for the time to come, and we hold this belief generally. So it was not knowledge that these numbers furnished, it was hope. When the predictions were valued, it was not for the historical clarity that they provided, but for the spiritual fortification. Insofar as they abetted hope, they were acceptable. Insofar as they impeded hope, they were not acceptable. For as Albo remarked in his discussion of messianic calculation, Hadvarim halalu hem kimit gamlim, hatikva sibat hachozek, v'hachozek sibat hatikva. These things are mutually determined. Hope is the cause of strength, strength is the cause of hope. While there is no correlation between messianic crisis and messianic activity, there is a correlation between crisis and messianic speculation. This is not hard to understand. In the wake of persecution and displacement, particularly in the wake of the expulsion from Spain, words of maybe and perhaps were not enough. There was a wound to heal, and the discussion of the Messiah and the concretization of the messianic promise helps to heal it. But again, adversity is never the whole story. I would suggest also another way to understand this disjunction between messianic fantasy and messianic activity. This disjunction is problematic. It seems like a contradiction only if we continue to accept the most common assumption about Jewish messianism, which is that it is essentially revolutionary. Sholem in particular stressed the revolutionary character of Jewish messianism. He painted a long and exciting portrait of the messianic energies in Judaism, and with the flamboyant figure of a certain Moses Dobrushka, a Moravian Frankist who became a Freemason and died right next to Danton at the guillotine in 1794, he believed that he had traced those energies all the way to the French Revolution. More generally, the revolutionary interpretation of Jewish messianism has been popularized by philosophers and scientists, social scientists, according to whom Marxism and the revolutionary traditions of the modern world are at bottom translations of Jewish or Judeo-Christian messianism. But what if the opposite is true? What if messianism played not a revolutionary role in Jewish life, but a conservative role? Recall Scholem's famous formulation of Jewish messianism, a life lived in deferment. Scholem believed that messianism demanded a price, and the price was a certain unreality that attached to Jewish existence. Quote, there is something grand about living in hope, but at the same time there is something profoundly unreal about it. It diminishes the singular worth of the individual, and he can never fulfill himself, because the incompleteness of his endeavors eliminates precisely what constitutes its highest value. Thus, in Judaism, the messianic idea has compelled a life lived in deferment, in which nothing can be done definitively, nothing can be irrevocably accomplished. One may say perhaps that the messianic idea is the real anti-existentialist idea. Precisely understood, there is nothing concrete that can be accomplished by the unredeemed. To a student of the Jewish community of the medieval and early modern world, this passage is deeply vexing. Nothing concrete that can be accomplished by the unredeemed. As a description of the inner and outer realities of traditional Jews, this is spectacularly wrong. Jewish life was never as drained by the future as Scholem describes it. It was the objective of halacha and of the halachically constituted community to ensure that something can be done definitively, that something can be irrevocably accomplished, and this objective was attained annually, monthly, weekly, daily, and hourly. The remarkable thing about Jewish life in exile was not how much was deferred, but how much was not deferred. Anyway, what sort of ideal is the deferment of the ideal? Is not the deferment of the ideal, in fact, a way of making peace with the real? Scholem describes the duration before the Messiah as, quote, the centuries of exile when Jewish history was unprepared to come forward onto the plane of world history. I have no idea what he means by this Hegelian judgment. This long, unredeemed period in Jewish history was precisely the period in which the Jews created their civilization. More importantly, and here we approach the modern bias in the interpretation of Jewish Messianism, the Jewish spirit never regarded itself only or primarily historically, and never regarded history as the last word. If thinking messianically is the most intense way of thinking historically, then the circumscription of Messianism, the passion for waiting, the restoration of a more complicated and less inflamed view of its place in Jewish life, is also a limitation of the historical standard. So I would describe the conservative character of Jewish Messianism in this way. It protected the traditional acceptance of the world by confining the desire for change to a hope. For it was the premise of the current of thought that I am here describing that the acceptance of the world was worthy of protection. The acceptance of the world, indeed, was one of the great achievements of a people to whom the world had not been kind. This was the spiritual challenge posed by Jewish Messianism, to criticize the world without rejecting it, and to change the world without destroying it, or conversely, to accept the world without being complicitous with it. The paradoxical character of this messianic temper, the temper that wishes to conserve what it wishes to perfect, accomplished both these goals. Seneca, in one of his letters, once declared that you must either hate the world or imitate the world. But surely it is possible neither to hate it nor to imitate it. Messianic speculation was not an exception to the Jewish patience with history, it was an expression. Was hope then false or insincere, a form of bad faith? Was hope, as Scholem believed, the enemy of reality? Not exactly. The understanding of Messianism and Judaism will not be furthered by cliches about the relationship of theory to practice, because hope stands somewhere between theory and practice. It is the ground of, but not the reason for, historical action. Hope is a weak form of historicism. Kol masha yosif lehitacher yosifu bo tikva, Maimonides explained to the Jews of Yemen in 1172. The longer the Messiah will tarry, the greater will be the hope. Better hope than disappointment. That is the Jewish answer to utopianism. In the Jewish traditions, messianic speculation was a kind of thinking about change that was not a preparation for action. Messianic calculation described the point at which the world would be changed by an accumulation of actions, none of which were designed to change the world. The Mashiach would arrive, the ancient rabbis said, when all the people of Israel kept 2 Shabbatot. Did they mean that the keeping of Shabbat was a messianic activity? They did not. They meant only that the performance of moral and ritual duties by the individual and the community would have an effect upon the destiny of the Jews and upon the destiny of the world. But destiny must be attacked indirectly. We are not enjoined to live climactically, we are enjoined to live significantly. So, a Messiah who is not a revolutionary, criticism without nihilism, a change that is not an end, fulfillment without closure, a climax that preserves, a hope that neither lulls nor incites, bliss instead of pleasure, of paradise. Those are not contradictions. They are rather the terms of Messianism in Judaism, and they are remarkably unlike the terms of Messianism in modern Western politics. The great left-wing philosopher Adorno once wrote, "The only philosophy which can be responsibly practiced in the face of despair is the attempt to contemplate all things as they would present themselves from the standpoint of redemption." The Jewish tradition, or at least the portion of it that I have presented here, teaches otherwise. It teaches that in the face of despair, one must resist the temptation to redemption. For what is redemption if not a temptation to despair? Perhaps that is precisely where modern Messianism lost its way. It sought to meet despair with revolution. And against the revolutionary traditions of the West and the apocalyptic dream, I would leave you with this exhilarating remark by Shlomo Lebeit HaLevi in a commentary on a Talmudic parable. Ki me'achar shehu davek bo yitbarach, ma lo v'la churban. Im kol ze yesh lo koach lehitabek bizman hagalut, lo chaser min hashalem davar. If an individual cleaves to God, what does the destruction of the temple have to do with him? The power to cleave is available even in the era of exile. There is nothing lacking for perfection. Nothing, that is, in history. What is lacking for perfection is only the lack in ourselves. Thank you very much. First question about Lubavitch. Lubavitch?
Yeah.
I'll tell you, Lubavitcher Messianism, in my view, is of absolutely no interest to the history of Jewish Messianism. It is an important element, obviously, in the history of Chabad, and it has some important place in the history of Messianism and Hasidism, which is a complicated story. But it's not. It's as far as I regard it as a certain evolution within a certain sect. It is not part of the mainstream of Jewish Messianism.
So where do they deviate?
Well, they thought that the Mashiach came, and then they thought that he died, and then they thought that he might come back, which are not, shall we say, Jewish. The last two have a certain, that's what they believe up the street. That's what, but they deviated. Yeah. But and they call, I'm not here. I'm standing under these Chabad luchot. They damage themselves. I mean, if you want to understand the future, there is no Rebbe. It's not good. There will be a Rebbe anymore. I mean, the impact upon Chabad itself of the messianic nonsense is going to be vast, and it's going to ramify in all kinds of directions.
Do you see any particular differences between the Ashkenazi experience of false messiahs and Sephardic? Parallel differences? What would you say?
Oh no! I mean, well, well, as you know, generally Sephardic culture is always more colorful and more exotic. Shabtai Tzvi was, of course, the most colorful and most romantic and exotic and lunatic story of all. But David Molcho, David Rubeni, some of in the Sephardic world, I say everything is kind of spiced up, not just the food. In Ashkenaz, there were fewer false messiahs. So again, in the period of Shabtai Tzvi, remember that letter from Portas, he wrote it from Hamburg. I mean, there was a lot going on. But no, otherwise, no, nothing significant in that way. There was, I guess, some of the false messiahs in Sephardic culture, they had militaristic associations. They came as warriors. But remember, in Spain, the Jews, and in Portugal too, but mainly in Spain, Jews had risen very high in the court, and in the figure of Shmuel HaNagid, we actually produced not just a great courtier, but a great warrior, a great soldier, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what, it was more, the Sephardic Messianism was more cinematic.
So you don't find that the fact that the Shabtai Tzvi phenomenon that rippled hundreds of years later into the writings of Yaakov and then his accusations of other rabbis as being Sabbateans and so on. Do you find any of that? You don't really
well,
find
I'll
that.
tell you, after Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam, which shall we say is not what one would have expected the Mashiach to do. People, as you say, got accused of Sabbatianism, and Emden accused famously Eichschutz of this, and historians are still trying to figure out if Eichschutz was a Sabbatian or wasn't. My question has always been, what would it mean to be a Sabbatian in 1740? The Messianism had been discredited, first by Shabtai Tzvi's conversion, and then by the delightful but very non-Jewish orgiastic practices of the Frankists and so on, right? And was he practicing secret rituals? No. Did he add some stuff to the nusach of his davening? Maybe, but we're not talking. That's not exactly an apocalyptic revolutionary activity. So there was this. It'd be like accusing someone of being a communist now. right? I mean, if he turns out to be a communist, that would be nasty, in my view, but I don't even know what it would mean. I mean, it's post-Shabbat Wieseltierism exists, but it's sort of, it belongs in the history of Sabbatianism, not in the history of the Jewish people.
Isn't it a accusation of protection of Mormonism? Talks about you and Mashiach comes, all the rules change. I always thought the Irish thing was not that obvious and not the literature. But the underlying resistance, A, the belief that the children see like that, and B, the weakening of the commitment, exactly as you said, weakening of
Yeah, the only problem is that accusing Eibishitz of antinomianism is a very strange thing to do, considering that he was one of the great holists of his time.
Absolutely.
So he was either deeply divided against himself, or somebody was wrong here. I mean, it's just, if you're going to be one of the greatest halakhic figures of your time, then being an antinomian seems, etc.
Sure. So two comments that, if you have a response, I'd love to hear. Otherwise, then a question. So first of all, this sounds like the fleshed out version of a statement I once heard from Elliot Wolfson, that the Mashiach comes with his not coming, and he would not be coming through his coming.
That's the way Elliot talks.
I'm sorry? Yeah. And then I also thought it was interesting that you didn't tie, that you simply said that the Shabbat too is not connected with the events of Tach B'Tah. I thought that was interesting as well. And finally,
the question of, Sholem tried to show that there was some connection between 1648 and 1665. Again, historians have poured over this, and the links turn out to be more and more tenuous. Remember, the Khmelnytsky does his work in the Ukraine, and Shabtai Tzvi's from Smyrna, which may as well be a planet away. So it's not, the links are not, it's too neat to think that, adversity, Mashiach, adversity, there's a pogrom, so there's a redeemer. That's almost kind of a Christian way of thinking about it. It's certainly not, the Jewish historical pattern doesn't conform.
Do you include such a concept as התחלת דגאולה או ראשית שמחת גאולתנו in your structure that you just presented?
That's my question.
Well, as an empirical matter, the people who say Atchalta Geula and believe that the restoration of Jewish sovereignty in the state of Israel is of eschatological significance, obviously would put it in this tradition. That's an interpretation of a historical event that they make. The founders of the state, if you study the intentions of the founders, I don't have to tell you, that's not precisely what they had. My own view is that is an incorrect interpretation. I'm not going to get into it now, but I think that the state has no spiritual status whatsoever, and that the attribution of spiritual status to the state of Israel is a big mistake. But that's a whole other discussion. But I don't think that the phrase, Zionism, when religious Zionism, when religious thinkers became Zionists, one of the ways in which they combined religion and Messianism, religion and Zionism, was by giving some eschatological dimension, right, to what was happening. But I don't know. That seems to me to deviate from some of these traditions. That's a long conversation.
I was interested that you took the Jewish involvement in so many revolutionary movements in the past couple centuries out of this Messianic tradition, and so I wonder how you then account for so many Jews being so central to so many.
Well, I think that that's a big question. The first thing that has to be said is that I don't believe that the modern period is just a smooth translation of medieval and early modern. In other words, I think that modernity was a rupture, and I think that something new was created in the, I don't know, you date it from the late 18th to whatever, the early whatever, but that something new was created, and it won't do just to say this is that, only in new form. Secondly, whereas the role of Jews in certain revolutionary movements was pronounced, if you take a close look, as I once did actually, because I was curious about this, say, at the Jewish participation in the Russian Revolution, you discover that most of the Jews who participated in the Russian Revolution actually were not with the Bolsheviks, even though they became the most famous ones. The Bolsheviks won, right? But most of the Jews were either members of the Mensheviks or of the Cadets. Now, the reason, I'm not being pedantic here, the reason that's important is because the basic difference between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, as you will recall, is that the Bolsheviks wanted economic equality to precede political equality, which required a dictatorship of the proletariat, and the Mensheviks wanted political equality to precede economic equality, which meant that they were essentially liberals fighting alongside the revolutionaries, which is why, like all liberals fighting alongside the revolutionaries, they got killed. Right? I mean, there is this cliche, and of course Hitler believed it too, that that there is this cliche that Jews were somehow drawn to revolution. I think Jews were drawn to freedom, and they were drawn to the possibilities of social and political equality that were presented in the 19th century in a variety of settings in Western Europe and in Russia. In Western Europe, in Russia, there was no industrialization, as Marx famously noted. There was no middle class. There was simply, the contradictions were very sharp, as the Marxists love to say. And so if a Jew wanted to emancipate the Jewish community, revolution appeared to be the only option. In Western Europe, insofar as there were revolutions, there were bourgeois revolutions, but in the 19th century, the Jewish ticket, as it were, was the middle class. And if you look at the participation of Jews in the secularization and the modernization of Western European society, where there was industry and there was a middle class, the Jews were not among the extremists at all. They were not. The Jews actually, etc., etc. So I think the stereotype of the Jew in modern politics is more. It's much more complicated. And finally, I should say that my view generally is that that not everything a Jew does or says is Jewish. In other words, I have this view that if you want to count as Jewish something a Jew said or did, you have to provide some historical evidence that there was some Jewishness to that Jew, right? Otherwise, you basically wind up in the same place as the anti-Semites are, which is believing that psychoanalysis was a Jewish science, or things like that. So, some of the Bolshevik Jews did come from Jewish backgrounds, some of them did not. The people who ran the Yevsektia, the villains who actually destroyed Jewish institutions in the Bolshevik Revolution, actually did come from Jewish backgrounds. You have to know, as everyone here knows, if you want to destroy a shul, you have to know it really well, right? I mean, et cetera, et cetera.
Certainly one of the most notable aspects, as you pointed out, of the disputations over the Talmud, disputations of Christians and Jews, Maimonides and so on in the medieval era, was what was perceived as our stubborn refusal to accept their Messiah. Looking much forward in history, looking even to this century or the 20th century, was there a tremendous rupture on that issue, or do you see phenomenon that may persist to this day in Jewish-Christian relations in the United States, abroad, in Israel, that still go back to that old notion that we didn't accept a Messiah and we're clinging to a Messiah that isn't here yet?
Well, that's a good question. We didn't accept it. Very key fact. I think that I've never liked this. I mean, in some ways it's possible to speak of the Judeo-Christian tradition. I've never liked that phrase. I think that we're very different. And I think that however much a Jew can follow a Christian in terms of social values and this or that, the minute you hit the figure of Jesus, I think we're out. Or they're out, actually. We came first. I think that the question. Well, in the Middle Ages, as you know, the disputations between Jews and Christians were obviously, the rules were made by Christians. These were rigged, all these things. And the courage, when you read the protocols of Barcelona, Tortosa, the courage of Ramban and Alba was just beyond belief. But they were rigged. And because they were rigged, the Jews, for example, were never allowed to discuss Jesus. It was forbidden. Which is probably just as well for the Jews, because it would have led to riots and massacre, which sometimes happened anyway. So what was the conventional subject of the disputation was the interpretation of the eschatology copy of the Hebrew Bible, because the Christian claim that they fulfilled Judaism because the Messiah arrived was the subject of the disputation. And so the Jewish strategy was always to show the Christians, with all due respect and sometimes with real contempt, that they misread Judaism entirely on this question. That's why, as I said, when you read Ramban and Albo and Tortosa, there is, when they're in the middle of the disputation, their point there is to demote the status of Messianism and Judaism, because if Messianism is not as significant in Judaism as the Christians say it is, then the Christian claim to have fulfilled Judaism is false. That's how they went about it. The important fact, and this is why after you look at these protocols, you have to go look at what these writers actually say to their own community, what they write in Hebrew, as it were, for domestic consumption. The important fact to me was that they actually not only said the same thing to their brethren, but they said it in even sharper ways. But I think that, the figure of Jesus is, if you take theology seriously, it's possible not to, but if you take theology seriously and you believe that there is a significant theological distinction between Jews and Christians, which I do, then the figure of Jesus is one of those, and they get very stiff-necked about this.
So, to go to the other extreme, you gave incredible tour starting in the 12th century, but can you just give a few minutes on kind of Jewish views towards Messianism before Christ, in the Tanakh, in the Navi?
Well,
were they steeped in Tanakh?
Who steeped in Tanakh?
Were those views that you've gone through in history?
Well, the Tanakh, as you know, what we mean by Tanakh, what we mean by the Jewish Bible, is the Jewish Bible as interpreted rabbinically. Right? In other words, and the Messianism in the Jewish Bible is not. First of all, it's not as it has other meanings. It is not nearly as significant as some people tried to make Messianism. You see, what I've tried to show here, what I'm going to try to show if I ever finish this book, is that the idea that Messianism was central is actually a modern idea. And it was an idea that was created in a historicist culture which thought of everything as we do, historically and developmentally and linearly and teleologically, right? And that Messianism and that modern Jewish intellectuals needed Messianism to be as central as they made it, you see. But that if you look at the actual place of Messianism in the medieval tradition, in the medieval and early modern communities, it existed. Obviously, it's one of the things we believe in. But the centrality, the urgency, the starring role, it's not there. It's not there.
And there's really no effort to bring proof texts from Tanakh.
No, not really. No. I mean, there are the things there are things in Yeshayahu, and there are things in prophets. There are things, but no, not really. And again, I'm interested. As a Jewish historian, I have to say, and it's an odd thing to say, as believing Jews have to think otherwise, but as a historian, when I study the history of the Jews, in some significant way, I don't start with the Talmud, but since I regard Jewish civilization as essentially Talmudic, that's and rabbinic, when I read Tanakh, it's really about how the rabbis interpret it. That's why all this modern biblical scholarship is all very interesting, but it's weirdly at right angles to some of the things that interest us.
It seems to me that you're suggesting that there is a change in the historical continuity of dealing with this tension, that putting temperance on the messianic impulse somehow over time has perhaps been transferred or has changed. Do you agree with that phenomenon?
I'm not sure I understand what you said.
That perhaps just with the modern day state of Israel, that the idea of dealing with our destiny as a people in a land and the tension that comes with that, and realizing those perhaps messianic aspirations in the land itself, does that take away from perhaps the initial.
No, it depends. I mean, it goes back to Raphael Manikin's question. I mean, look, there are two ways to interpret this. The other way to interpret it is the Satmar way. I mean, I despise the Satmar on political grounds, but ideologically, when they argue against the Zionist reading, a messianic reading of Zionism, they are not being inconsistent with their tradition. And their objection, and their belief in quietism, and their belief, about hakelo, that you must wait. What they're arguing against Zionism is a lot of the stuff that is in our tradition. And it's the people who want to use Messianism as a justification for Zionism, or to interpret the state of Israel messianically. In some ways, those are the people who are deviating from the tradition and have to make the arguments that they make, and so on. The interpretation of text, and that's another thing. Yeah. Mark, I know I've heard it.
Yeah, I guess I'll ask one question and answer. I just learned on Friday, there's a new book out about the history of Fiddler on the Roof, and one of the things I learned was that apparently there was a book about waiting for Messiah that was dispensed with before they made the play, and it has Tzvi very cleverly saying, I couldn't find you, there was a few of you here, there was a few of you there, and now I found you. And I'm wondering if, in doing this book, or thinking about this, and you touched on it with Kafka, if you thought about Jewish thinking on this in a non-religious, more modern, more secular sense, whether it affects other areas of Jewish thinking artistically or in literature.
Yeah, I guess, I haven't, Ramban and Rambam are hard, but Fiddler on the Roof is murder. To get to the bottom of that is really hard. No, I tell you, I don't see a lot of messianism right now. Certainly in American Jewish progressivism, I don't see it. What people mean by tikkun olam, I guess that's not a messianic doctrine, even though it is a doctrine. It is a belief in the perfectibility of the world in some ways. It's also a total misreading of what tikkun olam really means, to a degree that is simply, it's just almost illiterate. No, I don't see, we are, in Israel, you could argue that some of the settler movement has a certain does have an eschatological orientation, and some of the culture, the Jewish culture around them has that. But in a funny sort of way, that's not really about the figure of the Messiah. It's, I don't see that. I don't see that very much anymore. No. But I will take a closer look at the
I guess I can amplify just this sense of irony, frankly, in the belief in idealism, but knowing we're nowhere quite near it. It strikes me as a big part of a lot of Jews in the culture.
Yeah, look, again, A, idealism, there are non-Jews who are idealists too, so we should flatter ourselves because it's unique to us. B, idealism is not the same thing as messianism. Halacha is idealism. Halacha is idealistic. It really does believe that the steady accumulation of the fulfillment of the commandments, as I said, will actually impact the destiny of the Jews and of the world. It is idealistic in that sense. You wouldn't know it from a lot of people who practice it, but it is. But it is. But idealism is sort of one thing. I would say that the thing that interests me most, and I didn't get to this part yet because I brought too much anyway, it was a long lecture. Let me put it this way: there are two general pictures of the genius of Judaism that you find in American Jewish culture, but more generally. One is that the Jewish genius was for the past, and so we pioneered in collective memory, which we did, and we may even have invented the idea of tradition in some sense, which maybe we did. And we have found ritual and liturgical and other ways to commemorate things. That we, Ki'iluhu Yatzam Mitzrayim. At the Seder, that we have this genius for bringing the past alive and commemorating. The other is that the Jews have a genius for the future, and they invented the idea of the Messiah, and they invented the idea of the end. And they invented everything that's in the second paragraph of Aleinu. Right, and all those things. I have to say, the more I study it and think about it, I think the Jewish genius is for the present. And I think that is a genuinely radical thing. The only other religion or worldview that I know that is as has this in some very ironic way, which couldn't be more different than Buddhism, but it is, you know, mirroring it. But I think the Jewish genius turns out to be for the present, and that when I continue, I mean, once I finish my analysis of Messianism and Judaism, what I want to do is make a kind of philosophical analysis, even outside of Jewish sources, of what it means to live significantly in the present. Because it's pretty clear to me when you look at the circumscribed place of Messianism and Judaism, as I think is the case, that the real Jewish genius is to have commemorated the past and anticipated the future without letting the past or the future bleed the present, without letting them colonize the present to such a degree that there is something about the Jews and the present and the actual world that is genuinely radical. And it's genuinely radical because, again, it's not complacent. It's not saying whatever is ought to be. It's not, you know, it's not Pope. It's not, I mean, Alexander Pope, not just Pope. But, you know, it's not that at all. And so that's where you sort of wind up going. I promise you.
It's a question about the lost tribes of Israel.
The lost tribes of Israel.
Lost tribes. There are several groups in Israel, in Europe, and the United States which are actively looking for the lost tribes of Israel, specifically the Bnei Moshe.
Yes.
And I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts about why there are still people looking for these lost tribes, and their express purpose is to bring about the coming of the Mashiach. That's their goal.
Well,
there is a lot of money in this.
To begin with, there are some traditions that the Mashiach will come, the lost tribes will come back. There are other traditions that have nothing to do with this. The moving fact is that there are many people around the world, groups who would like to be thought of as Jews. I mean, I find myself quite moved by that fact. You know, and I tend to would like to be as welcoming as I can. In fact, what we could do is maybe we could take some of the people who say they're the lost tribes, invite them in and swap them out with some of the Jews. And I know just which ones I really But I think that, I don't know that it bears upon, first of all, there's been various writers have tried to identify various groups in India or China as the lost tribes. Nobody, I think, has successfully identified them. I think the 10 lost tribes are a romantic fantasy that endures within. I mean, it is an amazing fact that, you know, that somebody can manage 80% of the Jewish people vanish. Now, it is not an amazing fact if you think that when people get sent into exile, that's what happens. One of the reasons that the Assyrians exiled the 10 tribes, one of the reasons that population transfer, as we would now call it, was an instrument of conquest. Was precisely to bring about this, to dilute the identity so that no such group ever exists again. So in that sense, it's not amazing, but I don't know that it bears much on this.
You quoted a notion that adversity sort of made the better Jew because reward was better when you acted in the face of adversity. Do you think that was an honest...
Wait, what did I... Oh, yes. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's
yes.
That's sort of an elitist view, that maybe for tzaddikim you would do better because you were going to perform well in the face of adversity, but for the lay practitioner, that's probably not the case. Do you think
I don't think it's about elite,
or...
No, I think it raises a larger philosophical question, which we're not going to go into now, but it raises the question of whether or not of the spiritual role of suffering. In other words, whether suffering is necessary for either redemption or for wisdom. Right? I mean, there are traditions that believe that suffering is necessary for wisdom. There are others, I mean, you know, and this is a big subject. I remember, so that's a way of, there was a professor of philosophy who died last week named Arthur Danto. He was my first teacher of philosophy when I was at Columbia. And I remember very vividly a conversation about Nietzsche with him in his office in Philosophy Hall when I was a little boy with a yarmulke on my head. I guess I'm a big boy with a yarmulke. In which we argued about this, and he said to me that Nietzsche, he'd written a book about Nietzsche, which I read, and he said Nietzsche was completely wrong about that. There's no reason to think that suffering is required for wisdom. It is, you know, and that there's something morbid about that, and the glorification of suffering is a kind of anti-humanist impulse, and one shouldn't glorify suffering in this way, that it should be possible for people just to, by virtue of the fact that they were born of a man and a woman and have all the normal difficulties that any ordinary life would have. It should be possible in an ordinary life to acquire wisdom just out of the excruciations of love and friendship and family and desire and et cetera, that you don't need the apocalypse and you don't need cancer to be wise. But this is a large subject. This is a large subject. What was striking to me about the Ramban's sentence, well, I mean, from a modern point of view, you'd say this is very anti-Zionist. You know, it's kind of dumb to call anyone in the 13th century Zionist, not Zionist. But it is quite striking that he really believed that the reward would be greater. The reward would be greater. And in the Gemara too. I mean, look, there's nowhere that I know that it says in Judaism. You'll tell me about rabbinical literature if this is where it says that suffering doesn't matter, or if you suffered more, you won't have a greater reward. Of course, you can have a greater reward. I mean, that's the machinery of consolation in some way. But the question of whether suffering is required for wisdom, or whether pain is necessary for redemption, that's a big subject, and people, religions, philosophers divide on it.
See, I had viewed the way that you quoted it as less about the suffering, more about the challenge.
The challenge being
to behave in the face of hurdles to that type of behavior. Whether those hurdles were whether one had to suffer. It was not that the suffering was imposed; it was that the suffering was held out as a potential consequence.
But remember, there are religions, and in Judaism, actually in Ashkenaz, in the 12th and 13th century, we have weird evidence of this because they get influenced by their surroundings. There are mortifying or self-mortifying elements within medieval Judaism, though I would say that generally we are not a self-flagellating people. In fact, a little self-flagellation wouldn't hurt sometimes. But we're not a self-flagellation. But again, it depends on the environment. I remember once I saw in Jerusalem at the Museum of Islamic Art, at the Meyer Museum, there was an exhibition, a show of Jewish objects from Afghanistan. And what was included there, I bought the catalog just to have the picture of it, was something that was described as the Yom Kippur whip. Because they lived among the Shia. And the Shia, as you may know from now that everybody knows about the Shia, on Ashura they take these whips, sometimes with razor blades, so they just wouldn't have razor blades, and they beat themselves until they bleed. And there actually was a Yom Kippur whip there. So again, the question of mortification in Judaism, you know, it depends where and when you're talking about and so on. That's another big subject.
Since you asked, there were people from Sarah.
Yeah,
the interpretation ranged from general reward, but you did find some people who talk about it as increasing wisdom. It means according to the suffering is the reward.
Well, people who actually Kibiyachal go looking for it. I mean, well, Rabbi Akiva, when he was martyred, right, he waited his whole life to be able to do this. The whole martyrological thing, which, as you know, is an interpretation of the Jewish sources. It's not in the Jewish sources. One more?
So, hearing your remarks on that, I sort of think a little bit of, well, anti-Messianism in the Western political tradition. I think almost about Hobbes, to both the remarks, the quote from Nachmanides in particular, Noah, and just more broadly. I was wondering if you've seen if the strand of Jewish thought has influenced Christian political thought understood more broadly at all.
Not here. I mean, generally, I should tell you, I'm not of the persuasion. I know that there's, and you certainly know because where you hang around, there is a cottage industry now, looking for the impact of Jewish sources on modern political philosophy and so on. I mean, I have to see chapter and verse. I don't think that one can state generally that there's that democracy was born in Judaism in some way, or that liberalism was born. You know, there are influences and so on, but I don't see any. Where do you see Hobbes in the Maimonides?
Unless you're, that accept you as king, that there's no authority in Judaism because of.
No, I'll tell you where there is the Leviathan kind of king. It's also in Spain, but it's in the Ran. He had in his drashot, the famous 11th drashot of the Ran. That drashah is very famous. Jewish liberals love it because in that drashah, the Ran basically separates the religious power from the secular power, and it's sort of liberals who like to quote, go kind of trolling in Jewish sources for sources for the separation. They go to the 11th drashah of the Ran. The interesting thing is that what they don't